Before we begin, I would just like to say I don't have any hatred towards James Alsop. I actually think he's a pretty intelligent guy. I don't consider him to be alt-right per se because he himself, I think on a few occasions has said he doesn't usually use the term alt-right, so I don't think it's quite fair to label him as that. However, it was pretty fair to say that he's defended the alt-right and he does have some similarities to them. So he's going to be used as more of a vehicle in this video to talk about the overall trade policy of the alt-right, but this will probably not be the first or the last video, so no personal attacks, and please don't go over to his channel and harass him. This is more like an ideological difference debate, and that's really all it's going to be. I don't, like I said, hate him in any way, shape, or form. I actually think that the alt-right is pretty cool in some ways, but there's a reason why I consider myself alt-light and not alt-right. So without further ado, let's get into this video.
He promised it would happen during the campaign, and now it has. In 2016, Donald Trump ran on the promise to put America first on immigration, national security, and trade, among other issues. And this past week, he made the first high-profile move on trade of his presidency. President Trump announced that the United States would begin charging a new tariff on steel and aluminum imports into the United States. Steel will be tariffed at 25%, and aluminum will be tariffed at 10%. These measures are designed to protect the American steel and aluminum industries while keeping jobs in the U.S. and incentivizing companies with factories overseas to move those factories to the U.S. Naturally, yes, this means that companies will be paying slightly more for steel and aluminum because Chinese imports will become more expensive. Economic globalists and cosmopolitan economists took to the airwaves over the weekend to express their disdain for the notion that America would pursue an economic policy that protects American industry, just like every other country in the world. In today's video, we'll take a look at the history of American tariff policy. There's a lot of misinformation out there. We'll look at what tariffs actually do to the economy and how they'll benefit American industry and the nation as a whole. And we'll respond to some of the criticisms levied by our good friends in Conservative Inc. But first,
sorry guys about cutting you off there, it's just that he's going to go ahead and talk about things such as his sponsors, and obviously that would make a lot of sense in my response video. So make your money however you're going to do that, but let's move on.
what is a tariff? A tariff is similar to a tax. It's charged, usually as a percentage, on specific classes of imports into a country. For example, if there were to be a 25% tax on shoes being imported from China, and I imported $1,000 worth of shoes, then I, as the importer, would also have to pay $250 to the US government. Let's say there's an American shoe company we'll call USA Shoes, and there's a Chinese company called China Shoes. USA Shoes are made in America by American workers that are paid a fair wage and contribute to the American economy. China Shoes are made in China by sweatshop workers, and their wages are reinvested into the Chinese economy. Because China Shoes uses sweatshop labor and doesn't pay their employees fairly, they can produce shoes for less than USA Shoes. As a result, if they flood the market with China Shoes, they can undercut USA Shoes to the point where USA Shoes will go out of business, taking those thousands of American jobs with them. If the American government puts a 25% tariff on the importation of Chinese shoes, it raises their price to be comparable with those of American shoes, thus financially disincentivizing the purchase of Chinese shoes and creating a situation where more consumers are more likely to buy USA shoes.
Now let's get into kind of the meat of what he was saying. So essentially, think about this. You buy some shoes from China, they come over here, it gets taxed at about 25%, 30%, whatever. That raises the price. Now they're the same price as American shoes. And here's a little bit of my problem. Now, I'm not exactly, one of those people who says, "My capitalism!" But at the same time, I kind of recognize when things are going a little bit too far. His key word there is incentivizing. Well, let's look at human psychology since we're talking about the economy. I know that sounds a little bit weird, but we're going to do it. So there are only two things that really motivate an action, meaning to do an action. That is positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. Positive reinforcement can be defined as essentially offering a reward for doing a certain action, while negative reinforcement could be offering regret of missing out on said reward for not doing that action. This is not to be confused with punishment, which is done to stop a type of action to be done. Now, the reason why this is important is because, unfortunately, James Alsop is talking about the idea of doing something that I think only addresses part of the issue. Part of the issue is, yes, China is definitely a manipulative government, of which is part of the reason why I don't agree with ANCAPs and that you should have no government onto yourself, because if you don't, you can't exactly deal with other people who will just say, fuck you, do what we want to do, we'll manipulate our currency. With that being said, unfortunately, that's not the only reason why a lot of American companies are going over. I know a lot of business owners, and one of the biggest reasons why is because it's just too goddamn expensive to make products in the US at this point. Taxes are extremely high, the government is overly inflated. I literally know a bunch of small-time bankers who say that, yeah, Dodd-Frank went way too far, and there's so many damn regulations, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. This would kind of not really solve the problem all the way. Now, am I completely against a tariff in the long term? Not necessarily. Perhaps while we are reducing the welfare states, deregulating a lot of government entities, and rolling back the government to more of a small-time minarchist government, this might be an okay idea. But this is definitely far from a cure-all. Now, I don't want to say that James Alsop is saying that this is a cure-all. However, I do see that this tends to be a big mantra amongst the alt-right. Simply, look out for America's interests first, but do it in a way that may not be good in the long term. This is part of the reason why I don't think that National Socialism works. Now, is James Alsop a National Socialist? No, and I'm not going to use the Nazis, they were coming arguments, because let's be honest, well, there are probably some neo-Nazis in the alt-right movement. That's probably because the alt-right is very loosely defined, and you can't exactly tell a whole lot of people no when you have a very loosely defined movement. So, James Alsop is not a Nazi, nor are most people in the alt-right. But with that being said, I think you get my points. Overall, I don't think this is the best long-term solution. You'll be forcing people to just eat the fact that they have to deal with extremely high taxes in the US. I don't think that's a very good idea.
That same scenario is effectively what's going on right now with Chinese steel, Chinese electronics, and just about every other manufactured good. They're made for cheaper in China than Americans can make them for here in America, and as a result, when they're dumped onto the American market, they sell for less and put American manufacturers out of business.
Now let's talk about it like this. What James Alsop is talking about clearly is punishment. He wants people to be punished for going over to China, which does make sense because that is a part of motivation. That is a way of getting someone to stop an action. But at the same time, he should also offer a reward. The reward being that we really lower the bureaucracy. As you know, I'm not exactly a fan of the huge welfare state that's already out there. And part of that is because we both know that it puts huge strains on the economy. The government, especially the presidential office, is already too big as it is. We probably shouldn't even think of the president as being as important as he really is, but we do. I think that if we really lower the taxes, we would see a whole lot of people being more willing to come over here. But like I said, we should also have a punishment, because then it becomes an option to come back to the United States, not a demand if we don't have a punishment. With that being said, let me show you a little bit about Dodd-Frank. Now, for those who don't know, Dodd-Frank is something that a lot of small-time bankers and regional banks don't really like, because it's essentially regulations that were somewhat necessary, but got blown up way too big to the point where they became unnecessary. As you can clearly see from this article I've pulled, Dodd-Frank has about 2,300 pages to it alone of regulations. This is actually why small regional banks, of which I have some friends who work at them, have to hire other people in their company just to go ahead and look over some of these regulations on a regular basis. It's nothing but a strain and an unnecessary one. It has made the big boys the only ones who can compete in the United States banking system, and the small people who have moved out. And granted, yes, banks aren't exactly going to oversee a lot of their businesses. That doesn't make sense unless you're going to go ahead and give call centers to India. I'm not sure. But at the end of the day, this is just one example of how the US has kind of screwed over businesses by forcing them to apply to regulations that make no sense. You can't just offer a punishment like tariffs. You also have to offer a reward like lower regulations. If you do one or the other, you're kind of missing the points.
Now, that's the overview on why a tariff is implemented and what it is. Let's look specifically at the history now of American tariff policy. Up until the early 20th century, tariffs made up the greatest source of federal revenue. In fact, an incredible 95% of all federal revenue used to come from import tariffs. The Tariff Act of 1789 was one of the newly formed American Congress's first acts, and tariffs comprised the plurality of federal revenue until the introduction of the income tax in 1914. Tariffs have historically been used by the government in order to generate revenue and protect American business. It wasn't until the 20th century that we decided to begin taxing our own income instead of taxing the importation of foreign product.
But are we really sure this was for the better? When you really think about it, most of the government revenue should not be coming from a foreign nation. It should actually be coming from its own people and the GDP that comes associated with that. I can understand getting a little bit better with trade, but this is one of the problems I have with the alt-right. They seem to be very much isolationist, and that, as we both know, doesn't necessarily work. Japan, China, perfect examples of how those don't work. Now, we can get into details about those countries at another time, but it seems like this isn't exactly the best way to solve the US economy, especially when it comes to keeping jobs in America.
Let's take a look now at some of the criticisms of tariffs. On Ben Shapiro's show on Friday, he flew off the handle and yelled about how dumb and stupid and not good Trump and dumb and stupid he thought Trump was for proposing these new tariffs.
Oh boy. Well, but before we even get into this, I'd just like to say, yeah, I still consider myself to have a little bit of a fan base with Ben Shapiro. I still listen to his podcast every once in a while because every once in a while he does make good points. Hell, even if we want to make Ben Shapiro out to be the devil, which I don't think James Alsop is doing, even the devil can quote scripture. So every once in a while he might say something that's pretty good, and I don't think he's a complete idiot. With that being said, I don't exactly find myself to be as big of a fan as I used to be. Because yes, it seems that he has started going down a path where he's taking more and more pot shots at the alt-right and sucker punches and not really offering them a fair fight or giving them good representation. Hell, he even called James Olufsen a mass shooter at one point. Did I just say James also? Fuck it. I'm leaving that in there. I'm leaving that in there because that's funny.
This here's one of the tamer cuts from the Friday show. He was totally off the handle.
Okay, this is all stupid. It doesn't make any sense. It's economically illiterate. Okay, I was writing full pieces in March 2016 about why Trump's trade policy was idiotic. He and Bernie Sanders basically have the same trade policy. Note to everyone, if you have the same policy on anything as Bernie Sanders, you're stupid.
Oh shit, looks like we got an edgelord up in here.
Does anyone think that'd be good for the economy? No, because this is stupid. STOOPID. Stupid. Price of beer is going to go up too. Every beer can in America is made with aluminum, which means that if you like your beer, you're not going to get to keep your beer. The price on it is going to go up, which is, I think most Americans are not going to be super happy with that.
Oh no, ma beer. This is the end of civilization as we know it. Bugman uprising when? You know, for a guy who claims to value facts over feelings, Ben Shapiro isn't exactly the paragon of honesty here. Given the amount of aluminum in your average can, the price of a can of beer would increase approximately half of 1 cent. In other words, your 12-pack is going to cost approximately 6 cents more. I wonder why Shapiro would leave that fact out. We all know he is about the facts after all.
Okay, before we go any farther, I'd just like everyone to know, no, I do not agree with what Ben Shapiro just said. Otherwise, I wouldn't have put that joke that's totally going to get me sued by the ADL once I become popular in there. With that being said, I think it's important to realize this. The slippery slope fallacy isn't really necessarily a fallacy. When you really think about it, there is such thing as a slippery slope. As women voted overwhelmingly for government once we got them the right to vote, the nuclear family is becoming more and more broken up, and people are in more and more debt because of the fact that they can't pay their bills. That's not a good thing. With that being said, I think that if we go too far without having a clear time to cut off all of this, including the tariffs, I think this could become a really bad solution. I'm not in favor of bigger government, and I'm very, very skeptical as to how well our government currently is doing as it stands. I don't think James Alsop is saying that he's for this either. And in fact, I think he might even agree with me on a few of these things, but I think it's very, very careful water we should be treading. Going too far with this could easily backfire.
Another criticism of tariffs comes in a line you'll frequently hear from self-described conservatives. They will decry tariffs as social justice for corporations. Losing all your jobs to China. Need a safe space, stupid American. Tariffs are designed to protect American political and economic interests, of course. There's no doubt about that. And of course, tariffs wouldn't be necessary if American goods were cheaper than Chinese goods. So yes, this is government intervention. You can label it and dismiss it as social justice if you wish. But we need to ask ourselves, how much of our economy are we willing to jettison in the name of free trade and globalization and cheap products? The Chinese and others will always be able to manufacture goods for less than we will. Their workers are paid a fraction of what ours are and have a fraction of our quality of life. In a race to the bottom, which is what competition is, those willing to live with the worst conditions will always win. So the question isn't who can manufacture goods cheaper. We know the answer to that. It's the Chinese. Instead, it is how do we as a nation protect our economic and national security?
I actually think I have a much better solution. The solution I propose is this. Yes, we do implement a tariff because tariffs are not necessarily bad in the short term. Perhaps in the short term we can implement a tariff while lowering the welfare state, shrinking the size of the government, and reducing taxes, which will make it much easier to do business in America. Not only will consumers have more money to spend on American goods, but at the same time, if we reduce the corporate welfare tax, that would be a lot better. Because then it would be much more affordable to actually do business in America. And we can also have a little bit of a tariff to disincentivize people going over to China. But how about this? How about this? I think we can all agree that China is essentially the McDonald's of most countries. It doesn't really produce a whole lot of good, high-quality things. It only produces a lot of things that are easy to produce anyway. That's why oftentimes tech companies export their products to be assembled in these Chinese factories. But they don't really have a design or anything else in China. So how about this? The US focuses most of its products on quality. Think about this. If they're McDonald's, why don't we become like, pick a restaurant that's better than McDonald's. Let's go with Qdoba, or even better, Uno Chicago Grill. Now, maybe you're a fan of them like I am, maybe you're not. I don't care. I think we can all agree that the food from Uno Chicago Grill is 1,000 times better than anything you'd find at McDonald's. What if that was kind of a bit of a compromise? Because Japan is not a country that has low quality anything, nor does it really produce low quality anything. It produces high quality material, and they are way richer than China. They're doing good despite the fact that they have to constantly import most of their resources. Granted, they are never going to outcompete Chinese labor, but they absolutely do outcompete them in making cars and making designs for cell phones. They focus on the more important aspects of products. That's what we can do. Countries will have different specialties that they can be specialized in. This is inevitable. It's not something you can just escape simply by throwing it under the rug of a tariff. It's not really necessarily a good idea long term. But I do understand what James Alsop is trying to say, and I don't think he's an idiot for saying this. I really don't. I think that he's just a little misguided. Like I said at the beginning of this video, the alt-right has the right diagnosis, but not necessarily the right prognosis. So, can we try maybe that?
Globalized trade has had the effect of bringing down the cost of goods, but that phenomenon has come with a cost. From 2000 to 2010, over 55,000 factories in the United States closed down, and along with them, 6 million manufacturing jobs were lost. That's right, 6 million manufacturing jobs. Some people point to our low unemployment as an explanation for why this really isn't such a big deal. However, keep in mind that we are also experiencing the lowest labor force participation rate since the 1980s. Fewer people now are working now than in the past, and much of that is due to the fact that the jobs they used to hold are simply no longer available, and that's due to, in large part, to globalization. America is headed down the path of becoming a nation of consumers, dependent on the world to manufacture all of our goods for us. This carries with it a significant risk. A lack of domestic industry places a nation at risk of shortages or price gouging at the hands of their trading partners. If America's steel industry goes under, for example, we will be dependent on foreign manufacturers to import our steel. And that poses significant risks for American infrastructure, defense, and manufacturing. We can see this happening right now with oil imports coming from OPEC and Russia and Venezuela and these other trading partners. We are largely dependent on the exports of our trading partners to determine oil prices in the US. And if there's a shortage from OPEC or a shortage from Russia or a shortage from Venezuela, then we are left scrambling to fill the gap between the supply available and the demand for it. When ideally the situation would be we encourage domestic production of oil and natural gas, and as a result we would no longer be subject to price gouging or artificial shortages being established by OPEC or Russia. We would be able to manufacture oil and natural gas for ourselves. This would be the ideal situation. In a recent column, Pat Buchanan proposed that America should learn from Europe and European trade policies. The European Union nations place a VAT, or value-added tax, on every import from the US. Exports to the US get a VAT rebate. In effect, this functions like a tariff. This has the effect of increasing exports, which add to the nation's GDP and benefit domestic producers. The goal of tariffs, states Buchanan, is to increase domestic production. It is to incentivize foreign companies to build factories here, to sell products here, not build factories overseas and then sell products into the US. This would, in turn, have a cyclical effect. More higher-paying jobs in the US means more people with disposable income, which means more saving and more spending on products, thus more demand, thus more need for manufacturing, etc. Trump's proposed steel tariff would raise the price of a car approximately $45. $45. That's a small price to pay for the consumer, but it adds up for the manufacturer, and more auto manufacturers are going to be incentivized to move their factories back to America or build new factories in America, which, by the way, is the largest automobile market in the world. These tariffs wouldn't have measurable negative impacts for the average consumer, but they would be massively beneficial for Americans that work in manufacturing or live in Rust Belt states or towns or are affected by those people and their purchasing power. This will be great news for American workers and eventually American consumers, but there will be an adjustment period where companies will be taking a slight hit on their bottom line. But I'm okay with that. I would rather have Americans and American industry benefit in the long term, even if it means there is some short-term stress for coastal business elites and rootless transnational cosmopolitan economists. Cheap consumer goods are nice, I guess, but having a strong national economy, that's even better. And if I have to pay $45 more for a car, knowing that it was made in America and I'm helping pay an American worker's salary, that is without a doubt money well spent.
Well, that's all nice and good, Mr. Alsop, but at the end of the day, are you really sure that this is what you want? Because there aren't a whole lot of limitations from what I've seen from this tariff. With that being said, are you really sure that this is what you want the US government to be doing? Because US government overreach is a very real thing. Sure, it might be okay in its current state, but how do you know that the US government isn't going to use this as a catalyst to continue to infringe on human rights and on civilian rights? How are you sure that this is not going to be the case? You have to be very, very careful because this is a slippery slope. Just how much government are you willing to have before it comes back and bites you in the ass? The fact of the matter is this: I don't think you're completely wrong about what you say or that you have any kind of malintention towards the people of your nation. You and I are both nationalists. Slightly different nationalists, but nationalists nonetheless. That being said, I really hope that you understand that this could come back to bite us in the ass. In the words of Benjamin Franklin, "He who sacrifices freedom for security deserves neither." With that being said, ladies and gentlemen, my name is Arcean and I am the Angel of Objectivism. Signing off. I actually think I have a little bit of ground we can... I think... Do you not understand? In the words of Benjamin Franklin himself, he who sacrifices freedom for security will... let me tell you a story. A story about a man with autism named Benjamin Franklin. Now, a long time ago, he done said some words... And they go to something like... I have a little bit of a solution to this, because I know I've just been bitching most of this video, but here's something I think we could all find as potentially middle ground. Now, just hear me out. You may not agree with everything, but I think there could be some middle ground met here. Maybe we could have this But in the long run, do you actually feel that this is a long... Fuck. That's all, folks.